All right, Marginal Gains listeners, we have an extra special one for you today. Old friend of mine, someone I'm also a huge fan of and inspired by on a bunch of levels. And I think this is going to be a interesting one, both technically, personally, for all of you to sit in and listen on. So I'm with my friend Jordan Rapp today. I think some of you may know Jordan as professional triathlete, multi-Ironman winner. Some of you may know Jordan as a national pursuit champion. I think some of you may know Jordan as a Zwift game designer. Some of you probably know Jordan from his collegiate rowing days. I mean, this guy has done so much stuff, and he's so fun and interesting to talk to. So please help me welcome Jordan Rapp to the show.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. I'm a huge fan of Marginal Gains and a big fan of yours as well. So I remember, I guess, meeting you virtually, right, on Slow Twitch Forum, talking about vertical compliance of, carbon discs, right? So the way that all good engineers should meet, right?
Exactly. Oh, I mean, it is amazing to think about how many people I've met through Slow Twitch, right? And we all share the same geekdom. I don't know what the word for that is, but there was that kind of golden era where you just had all of these minds, and in a lot of ways that's still going, but we just had so many of these interesting people in one place interacting with each other. And yeah, I did not remember that it was the vertical compliance of discs that that brought us together that first time.
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny. I mean, Slow Twitch is still. I mean, I have my current job because of Slow Twitch in more ways than one. So John Mayfield, who created Zwift, met Eric Min, our current CEO, through Slow Twitch. Eric found the photos that John posted of his JM trainer coach software that he built, as a winter side project, and that's what led to the investment, and that's what led to Zwift becoming an actual company. And then I met John through Zwift, through Slow Twitch, which is how I came to work at Zwift. And yeah, I mean, on the disc side, I remember I was racing for the Timex team, and we were originally riding on Bontrager wheels, and Bontrager at that time didn't have a disc. They were running rebadged 900s, and then I got one of the first prototypes of the Aeolus disc, which was that stress skin bonded to, that head-made carbon hoop, and that was like a super nice disc. It had like that kind of like wave profile, and like Bontrager was like selling them for like $4,000 and still losing, I think, something like $2,000 per wheel, even at that price. But it was for sure a more comfortable disc to ride than the old 900, which is so skinny and so stiff vertically. And that's how our friendship was born.
Well, I love that. What is it? They call that collective memory. That there's things that like one of us remembers and the other remembers, but when we're together, we can actually remember more than the sum.
Yeah.
I love that. So let's get started. I think we met then, and you were still in school at that time.
No,
you were racing, or you were just out.
I was. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think I was 24, I think, at that time, right? So I had basically sort of just started racing, more seriously. I worked for a year out of college at a job that, like, I started on a Wednesday, and on Friday I drove home and said to my parents, "Can I quit?" And they were like, "No, it's your first job. Like, you should stick around for at least a year.
Stick it out."
And so literally like a year to the day, I was like, "I'm resigning." And it was nothing against the job, right? It was totally me just not being at that point in my life where I wanted, to be sitting in a cubicle and, doing that kind of work.
Can I ask what was the job?
It was actually, I mean, looking back, it was a pretty interesting, in many ways, job. I worked for a company, and we did GPS navigation software that ran on pocket PCs, because those were going to be the next big thing.
Right.
But I interviewed as a programmer, but then didn't have sufficient background in, I think the software is, I want to say, written in C or C++. And I was mostly sort of familiar with Java at that time, and then basically got hired to do business development, only for them to realize that I don't actually like talking to other people all that much. So they then moved me into project management, and I basically, from that standpoint, it was super interesting. We had live tracking, like, so kind of like, now Google Maps or, Strava, even on Strava, right, where it's tracking you on your phone. And we were running this like literally on like, GPRS type,
Right.
like, UDP packets. Like we're like, oh, this is, I remember when 3G first came out, we were like, this is incredible, like so fast, right? But yeah, we had this sort of little GPRS backpacks, and, I think we were paying like, $150 a month for like, whatever it was, like a meg or something like that.
God, yeah.
Yeah. But a company I guess got recently, it was a company that was started by an advisor of mine at Princeton, and it's had to do with like routing and logistics optimization. Like they started out like the core products, and I think really where the value in the company was originally with freight train routing, right? Like if you've got to move on the rail system, something from like New York to Ohio, what's the best way to do it? And then they moved from that into trucking and did similar stuff with trucking. And so it was all enterprise stuff, and then they started with a consumer product, and I think that was ultimately a mistake. But from the logistics side of things was a super interesting project, And
that is interesting. Yeah, as you go through life, as you get older, I feel like logistics become ever more fascinating, right? I remember being a kid thinking, the Army was so cool, and now I look back and think, yeah, all the SEAL team and all that stuff, that's super cool, but how you get the fuel and the bullets and it's, you read some of these old, like these World War II books and realize how, just us tricking the Nazis into having their tanks, 40 miles away was a huge win, right? That buys you like a day, on the battlefield, and you think, holy crap, yeah, there's so much more in the logistics than I think we learned from watching war movies when we were kids, right?
Yeah, and I think, it's super interesting, right, where everybody talks about sort of the various price wars, right? And I think the real battlefront between like UPS, FedEx, Walmart, Costco, and Amazon is all on like supply chain management and logistics, and like where do you put your warehouses and how do you get stuff. And really fascinating, right? Just the sort of mathematical modeling. Like, there's definitely some heavy optimization going on. And I think everybody thinks that, they do it better than anyone else. UPS, I think, is still, to me, I think, is the best. And I think that's at least based on, demonstrated track record, but it'd be interesting to see if anyone can catch them. Certainly there's increasing need and motivation to catch them, but
yeah, no, that the world's changing so quickly, especially in those fields. But okay, so we started. You were we kind of glossed over because we started with first job, but you were at Princeton, and you were rowing.
Yeah, I was. I joked that I majored in rowing and minored in mechanical and aerospace engineering. I think. It's funny that there was a class, actually, we had a professor super into cycling, and there was it wasn't a full class, it was like a freshman kind of seminar, they called it, but it was all on like mechanical engineering and bikes, and I didn't take it because I was like, that's not it. That's not that interesting to me. Like, I don't ride, because I didn't ride a bike really my freshman year. I started riding after my freshman year when I had gotten into rowing. I remember I was 1999, and I at that time, right, stayed up watching Lance Armstrong win, his first tour, staying up to in the middle of the night, watch it on ESPN2,
right,
and like that's how I got into riding bikes, and like everyone's like, oh yeah, it's good for cross training for rowing, and then I sort, because I didn't go to Princeton as a rower, I actually went as team sports player, and then didn't end up kind of finding a niche there, and people were like, yeah, you should try rowing, and just sort of fell in love with it, and then that led me to cycling. And I think it's funny because looking back, the fact that I didn't really do kind of any engineering projects related either to rowing or cycling, I'm like, how did that happen? But I was a real car nut at that time, right? And I thought, like, I was, super interested in motorsports. My summer job, I worked on doing vintage and historic race car restoration and like on-track support for, so it's like we were maintaining cars that people were actively racing. And I thought, I was like, I'm going to go into F1, I'll go into NASCAR, and I think I fully intended that until probably about my junior year, when it's kind of like, I think I wanted to continue to pursue rowing, and I thought I wanted to go to the Olympics, and sort of shelve the whole motorsports thing. And then it was stuck around in Princeton. I basically took that job that I did in large part because it was in Princeton, and that's where the U.S. national team was based. And just sort of like I think a lot of, once I left college and the structure of being on a team and having a coach that was like very regimented, I thought like, I've done this for almost 4 years. Like, I know how to manage this. And, I definitely didn't.
Right.
Got injured. And then that sort of turned to riding my bike more. And then it's funny, I knew nothing about aerodynamics, and I went down to the local bike shop. It's actually, like, you might know the shop. It's a shop called Cop Cycles. It's like, I think the oldest bike shop in America.
Yeah.
Charlie Kunn. And I said, like, so are there races around here like that I could do? And he's like, oh yeah, there's like, you should come out. There's like a Tuesday night race. And I was like, well, how fast do you guys ride? And he was like, I don't know, 25, 27 miles an hour. And I was like, oh, I guess I can't be a bike racer, because I didn't know anything about drafting, right? I was like, well, I can't ride that fast. So I was like, I guess like bike racing's not for me. And then I remember, of course, that on the flip side of ignorance, I looked at like IronMan, and I was like, well, those guys don't actually ride that fast.
Right.
Of course, because it's like 112 miles, and so I was like, I should probably do triathlon. That seems way more manageable.
That's so funny.
And that's sort of how I ended up doing triathlon, and did my first year. And someone, who, it's looking back, right, like the true ignorance is bliss. They're like, you're pretty good, you should be a pro. And I was like, I am pretty good, I should definitely be a pro. And like, I don't think they had any idea what that meant. I certainly didn't have any idea what that meant. And thankfully, by the time I figured out what that actually meant, I somehow was good enough that I actually should have been a pro. And yeah, I mean, it was a lot of luck, and I think circumstance, and people extending a lot of kindness. And yeah, I don't know that it would be possible in the current environment. I mean, not just in the, like right now with all the uncertainty, but just, there's so many more races that I think sort of being recognized for winning, a race, like, that it meant something when I won Ironman Canada in 2009 in a way that it just doesn't mean anything in that same way now. And I think the industry is also, there's a lot of contraction. It was on the upswing then, right? 2012 was the peak, but it was for sure growth, and I think social media wasn't a thing in the same way either, so you didn't have the same sort of competition where it's like, we could sponsor you, or we could sponsor this, age group team, or this age group person who has, like 100,000 Instagram followers, right? Like, that was not a conversation. And that's for sure changed a lot, and I think, I'm glad that I did it when I did it, because I certainly don't know that I could do it now.
Yeah, it's a different world, right? I mean, it's interesting how we watch these like eras come and go. I mean, that was in a lot of ways, that era even through 2012 was still defined largely by Lance, right? I mean, it was almost, I can't think of a triathlete that I knew who wasn't in some way in the sport because of him, right? At some level. I mean, you had a handful of people coming from pure swimming backgrounds or whatever, but, so many people were brought into cycling by sort of the excitement around Lance and the tour, and then kind of ending up in triathlon for a reason or another. Oh, I swam in college, or I'm also a good runner. Yeah, and then we just kind of lost our mojo there in the sport, which is in both sports, right? Road and tri, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and I don't know that we could ever know like how much of that was fallout from Lance, right?
Yeah.
I think it certainly didn't help anything.
No.
But I wouldn't put the burden of that all on him, right? I think, people, we love to hang stuff on Lance, right. But like, I certainly don't think that that's something that you can hang on him. I think there was certainly some cost fatigue, I think associated with like the sport kind of got the people it could. And, like I remember when like sort of the big announcement was like, the $9,000 bike is now $12,000, right? And it's like, well, what about the like, and just you could only, I think, leave that sort of middle tier of bikes, out for so long. I think, when I look at other things that sort of disappeared, like I remember those leader frames, which were awesome frames, right? And like they're just that type of company just disappeared, right? Like there wasn't the $700 really nice aluminum frame set. I mean, you look at like the P3 SL and the P2 aluminum from Cervelo, right? Like all these awesome aluminum bikes that just people didn't want aluminum anymore, but aluminum, it's awesome, and it's definitely cheaper.
Right.
Right. So
yeah, it's certainly cost effective, right? And it just lost its whatever with the consumer. I think there's still some of my favorite bikes ever were aluminum, right? And it's funny the younger generation today completely cannot believe that. Right? They look at you like you're nuts.
I mean, like that the P3 SL, I think, is still to me, for all of the incredible innovation that Phil and Gerard led, I think making a bike like that with that, incredible curved seat tube and all of that, making that bike out of aluminum, I don't even know that people would try. I think Specialized has come the closest recently with that Allay Sprint, which is an unbelievable bike, and there's a guy at work who has one, right? And like the real innovation that they've done on aluminum. But I think like it's totally like if I needed to buy a road bike right now, like that is for sure the bike that I would buy. Like,
no, I'd agree. It's
just super cool.
There's a part of me that just looks at all of those complex forms and the way they're butted together and just think, my God, just cutting them accurately is so challenging, right? Not to mention the welding and the finishing and the filling. But it's for those of you who don't know it, we'll post a link to it, and on the video maybe we'll pop one up over the shoulder here. But it's a hydroformed aluminum frame that really looks like a carbon frame. So you're kind of getting the look and a lot of the stiffness of carbon at the price point of aluminum. It really is a masterful design.
Yeah, I mean, their own data shows that it's in many ways it's better than the, I think, 2012 or 2013 Venge. Yeah. Which is full carbon. And I think like 5 times the price for the frame set. So, and titanium is coming back too. I think because of gravel, right? I think, which is neat to see. Yeah. That. As I think titanium sort of was really king. I mean, it's crazy to think, right, that Cipollini won on that rebadged Lightspeed Ultimate. Right. And then people are like, titanium, right? And now it's coming back, I think, as a really great material for gravel, where you don't worry about rust.
I mean, remember think how many Pro Tour event stages, time trials were won on rebadged blades, Lightspeed blades, with 2 big sheets of titanium welded together to make a down tube and a seat tube. It was darn effective for the time.
Yeah, and I think an appreciation for the artistry there, right? Like for those folks that don't know, the Lightspeed titanium welders did a bunch of the welding on the Mars Curiosity rover, because when NASA was looking for like, who knows how to weld, like do super precision titanium welding, and like it's guys who make bikes out of titanium, right? Like if you can, I mean, guys like the Lightspeed guys, Carl Strong, those, I mean, they are probably the best titanium welders in the world.
Yeah, no doubt. Which actually brings us full circle back to the hand built, right? I mean, that hand built movement. I'm pretty depressed this year. I was going to give a talk at NABS about the history and really future of the marginal gains movement is the hand-built movement, right? I mean, it's the Graham Obrys of the world and the people trying to use, the 1/10 millimeter thinner wall thickness steel tubing and the Lightspeed guys. And I look at that now, the tinkerers of the future, a lot of them playing with carbon, but they're trying to find those tiny marginal gains, by reinventing, recreating, and there's a lot of skill required in that. It's not just some factory somewhere where you're typing it into a machine and it's spitting it out.
Yeah, I think I see sort of gotten into track cycling. The Dan Bigham, and what he, who came from, I think he was with McLaren F1, and then left that to sort of pursue his, passion for track cycling, and has really been the engineering driver at the Hoob Watt Bike team, and with his company that he has with his brother, Watt Shop. And if you look at the custom cockpit that they've done for the Argon 18, the custom armrests, and I think and then the guy that they work with, Mark Farrow, who make Pyramid Cycling Design, who makes these unbelievable chain rings, aluminum ones, but then also those Peak, which is that that crazy kind of composite blend, and there is still, it's awesome to see. I think gravel has been great for it. We'll see how much of it sticks around on track, with the big changes that the UCI has made there. But I think certainly from the standpoint of tinkering, gravel is, I think, where it's at, right? I think it's no surprise to me that Gerard, after leaving Cervelo, has sort of found his home with gravel and 3T. Like the roadside of 3T always seemed like a bit of a, I was like, I just don't know that you're going to get buy-in. And I mean, you saw that the pushback from Aqua Blue on running a 1x and all of that. But I mean, I ride an Exploro. I think it's it's one of the best all-around bikes that I've ever ridden. I also have a Lauf True Grit, and those guys from Iceland, their background is actually in biomechanical. That they were all prosthetics designers, right? And that's where that leaf spring comes from. It's like you think of, oh, that's like a carbon fiber leg, and
right.
That's exactly what it's like. And those guys, they just love cycling, and sort of started the Lauf as a fork company, and then now make bikes. And without gravel, would those guys have gotten into cycling? I kind of don't think so.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's been amazing to watch, and now we're starting to see Aero coming into gravel, right? We've got all these ex-pros starting these gravel careers, and I know that's a question we get all the time from both our listeners and from a lot of these guys starting these second careers of how important is aero and gravel, and how do I take advantage, because that's sort of it really is the next frontier of racing, at least for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Colin Strickland won Dirty Kansas because he had actually wearing a Specialized Evade, right? With a very good aero position on his clip-on aero bars, right? And he broke away with 100 miles to go, right? And I think some of it was disorganization on the part of the other guys. I think they could have chased him down if they had sort of been motivated to. But I mean, if he hadn't had aero bars, there's no way he could have made that stick, right? I think he would have gotten tired. But I think Kansas especially.
Yeah, it's funny. We didn't know him. We knew of him, but didn't know him at all. And he was the day before the race, kind of in the expo area, and we had a bike with our top tube bag on it. And he came by and he's like, "Is this thing pretty aero?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's pretty darn aero. More than a lot of them." And he bought one and put it on because he thought it was more aero than the bag he was coming from. It was just funny to see that little tweak the day before of it, but then the wheels turning, in his mind, right? I mean, he knew what he was going to do, and he was looking for every little bit of whatever. I typically come from the camp of don't change anything the night before your event, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that those mind processes that maybe we would have associated with triathlon 10 years ago or now that's gravel today. So I guess taking it back in time a little bit further. So when did you sort of find religion, so to speak, on aero? Was it once you were in triathlon and kind of realizing the opportunities there, or did it come slowly, quickly? What?
It was interesting. I remember I rode the first time, my first sort of real tri bike was a custom Serrata, and it was sort of a long story how I ended up getting that, and I think didn't have a great position, and I think sort of discovering power was the first thing that was when I started taking it more seriously, started being coached by Joel Filiol, who was at that time the Canadian national team coach, but still had, I guess, wasn't yet the Canadian national team coach, but coached Simon Whitfield and a bunch of others. And then, when he was like, you need to get a power meter. So I got an SRM. And that for me was the real revelation, because I was like, oh, this is exactly like rowing, right? Like so much of rowing for us was done by strict numbers. And like, there was definitely me before I got a power meter, and then me afterwards, where I was like, this makes sense to me. And I think that was the thing where I was like, oh, now I can actually start looking at, the difference that these things make. And I remember, came to it a little bit slowly. I think the first thing was tires. Like I remember this was like the early days of Tufo, and I was like on Tufos at like 170 psi.
Of course, yeah.
And I was like, and then I remember I got a, I think I flatted a Tufo, and I got a set of Vittorias, and I was like, whoa, these are nice, right? Like I was like, this is comfortable,
yeah.
Right? And I think from there it was, then all of a sudden like that was a very different sense of things. And I think it's interesting because I ended up doing some consulting work for Serrata, and like their project that they wanted some help was like, we really want to show that the value of a custom geometry and being able to put a rider in a good position, that trumps the aerodynamics of a frame. And it's interesting, like went on and sort of made a post on Slow Twitch kind of as I was thinking about this, and basically it was Andy Kogan and Gerard both were like, yeah, no, that's wrong. It's definitely, and like, I mean, Andy was a bit more blunt in typical fashion than Gerard was, but both of them, I think, it was like, they were like, you're not actually you're not reading this correctly. And a lot of it had to do with like yaw angle, right? And the Serrata line was that, I think presented yaw angles that were way higher, right? Because you're measuring free stream higher up as opposed to air slower down. And, I think they had still unreasonable sort of estimations of yaw, right? Like 15 degree plus is like a very normal circumstance, which it certainly isn't. And I think it was like in coming to that, I was like, oh, like I think I was had been asked to kind of do this research project and support. And I was like, when I started doing that, I was like, oh, like I actually like this is not true. And I think that was the one bright side of it is that I think that the focus on position was very legitimate, and I think I ended up I did start out riding on the time trial bike in a very good position because of that, and I think I always kept that. So it wasn't like I sort of had to make myself fit. And so I ended up taking my good position from my Serrata and then putting it on a faster bike, as opposed to say like, buying a bike that, wasn't the right size, and then kind of trying not to make it fit. So I was lucky in that regard. But then I remember getting on the first time, I sort of signed with the Timex team and getting put on the Lightspeed Lucero, which was a really good frame. John Cobb had done a bunch of work with those guys, and that was sort of an underappreciated frame, I think.
I'd agree.
Oh wow,
yeah,
this is fast. Like, I mean, seeing the same position on that versus this round tube Serrata that I had, and I was like, and I didn't perceive any real difference in like, quote unquote comfort or anything like that. And my position was exactly the same, and that's sort of where I got into tinkering, where I was trying to figure out like, how do I actually make this bike fit the same? And I ended up getting the custom like pro only brackets that Profile made, because to actually drop, and like finding low profile, like low stack headsets and a lot of that stuff, because I was like, I feel good in this position, but I want to ride this bike, and ended up, I think that was really to see that. And I remember, I think did my first race in 2005 on that bike in Florida, and I think at the Florida 70.3, the one that used to be at Disney, and I think outrode like the field there by like 6 minutes or something like that. Tim DeBoom, Luke McKenzie, a lot of those guys, and it was for sure, having good tires. I was at that point running Dugasts, and doing a good job gluing them, on an aero frame with a good position, and not having a bunch of like, junk on the bike.
Right.
And it, because the watts that I put out were not, they were not crazy, and I rode quick, and I think I was like, oh, okay, this is a thing. Ended up then on that same position, I think having the second fastest bike split at that first 70.3 Worlds in Clearwater, like 2:04 or something like that, just like a minute and a half or so behind Chris Lieto. And like that was sort of when I became, a cyclist, I think, and became somebody where I was like, oh yeah, this matters a lot. And that's where I started getting into tinkering, right? Like I remember like adding in a fairing under the tail of my Louis Garneau rocket, like that I made out of like, because I was still working on cars and stuff. So I went down to the shop and basically like cut a bunch of like thin PVC sheeting and made this basically drop tail so that the tail of, because like when I had my head down, I needed to fill in that gap. I'm sure it was like highly illegal, right? Because I had like drilled and riveted the helmet. But I think there was it certainly made a difference, and then started, I think, training in a serious way, and then I think got lucky in terms of just being on good frames. Went from that Lucero to the Trek TTX, which was also a quick frame, and then when I sort of then struck out on my own, and then when I finally got to come ride Zipp officially, and then you and Andy basically brokered the deal where I rode on a felt, and that felt DA, the DA is, I think just a legendary aerodynamic frame. Jim is awesome. And then went from that to the Specialized Transition, which I still think is another one of those underappreciatedly good frames. From that, then, 6 years with Specialized, from the Transition to the nose cone shiv, which is, I think, still my all-time favorite, TT bike, to the big down tube shiv, which I didn't love. It was not, I don't think, great. And, I think, I would say I sort of then, I think starting with that bike a little bit, I think I kind of lost my way in some ways, because every bike to that point had been, I think, very sort of purpose oriented. And it was tough because I never would have stopped riding the nose cone bike, but I was told, Specialized was like, you can keep riding that bike, but we're not going to renew your contract. Right. And that was hard. That was really hard, because I didn't stop riding that bike because I thought the other bike was faster. And I think it was the first time that I made a decision for a business reason rather than a performance reason. I think I started making too many of those kind of decisions. I mean, it's interesting. We did a podcast with McKeely the other day, and she said, like, what do you wish on the bike side that you sort of knew then that you know now? And I said, like, I was really, really good, I think, through like 2011, about like, and maybe the early part of 2012, where I was like, I was I think the first guy to win an Ironman on Zipp's Super 9 clincher, right? And this was when like people were still riding tubulars, but I was like, no, like clinchers are for sure faster. And I think good clinchers, latex tubes, not crazy tire pressure, all that stuff. And I think that was, I let it slip after that, right? Like I stopped pushing the envelope where it was, and I think, there's definitely races that I won only because like I just had a better position, right? Like I'm sure other guys rode higher watts, right? But I had better equipment choice, better position, all that stuff. And, the sport, first it caught up to me and then it passed me by, right? Like it still shocks me that I was not like one of the first guys running in a sleeve skin suit, or some of the higher hands, and, I think that kind of stuff. And I think, I stopped innovating. Some of that was, by necessity, in that, I had a family and then I had a mortgage, and, like that kind of stuff, I think I made worse decisions because of it. I understood them, but looking back, it's still like, I don't know that I did myself any favors. And I think that's the hard part, right? Is that like the pace of innovation does not slow down. Like I look, I measured my, on the track, made some changes, and, did some work with consult with Dan Bigham, just some experimentation. And like, I think I measured on last week on the track, my CDA on a track bike, right? So no water bottles, double discs, all that kind of stuff. But at, I'm almost 6'3", and I measured at 0.196 CDA, which is right. So like I still have room to go, right? Like, because like, I mean, if I did a full custom cockpit, like I think I could get it down into the like low 0.18s.
Oh wow!
Right? And I think like if I had done that same, like let's say I'm at like 0.22 or 0.23, I mean, I think you see this, right? Like we did an interview with Jan Frodeno, and riding 416 in Kona or whatever, right? And it's 4 watts per kilo. I mean, that's what I used to ride. I mean, I think every Ironman I won, I was over 4 watts per kilo, right? But why are those guys going faster? Because Jan, I mean, you see he, that Canyon, right? He has even the custom cockpit, right? So that it doesn't have that additional frontal area, and he has that custom helmet from Oakley. I mean, all the work that he does on the clothing side, working with Bont, so he can run basically like their sort of track style shoes, but in a triathlon equivalent. It just all matters. And I mean, it's funny because I think like he's notorious where like he wanted like a exclusivity on tires in triathlon from Continental, and like they wouldn't give it to him. But like kudos to him for like being like, no, I want this. Yeah. And he was pissed when I think they gave him to Patrick Lang and Sebastian, because I think that is what it takes. And I had that and I let that slip. Which was unfortunate, because I don't think there was any reason that I should have let it slip.
Interesting. Yeah. So somewhere in the middle there, I want to touch on you have this crash, and which was, I can't even honestly remember who called me, but someone, might have been Dave Ripley, but somebody called and it's like, Jordan's been in this accident and he might not make it. And it was just this like, oh my God. I mean, so I guess put some perspective on it. You were how old at this time?
I was 29. And I mean, it was, so today is March 24th. It was 10 years ago yesterday, 10 years ago to the day yesterday. I mean, I had just gotten married. I had just sort of finally broken through one, Ironman Canada, Ironman Arizona. In 2009, I think I had come 6th at the race in Abu Dhabi with the fastest run split of the day. Kind of botched the ride a bit. But, I really was like, I felt like I was really hitting my stride. And, and then, I mean, I sort of almost didn't make it. Thankfully, Navy NCO, at then Chief Petty Officer, now Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired after 21 years, Tom Sanchez, decided to basically get out of his car and stick his hand inside this giant hole in my neck and push down until the ambulance arrived. And I mean, from there it was just about 3 weeks in the hospital, and then, got out. And I remember actually, like, one of the first people that I talked to, like, I was in the ICU ventilated for about 3 days, but then I remember, thankfully I was on an Android phone then, because this was before iPhones allowed tethering, and so I was able to tether and have internet access. And I remember I had one of the first conversations that I had with anyone was with you, because I wrote to you and I was like, I don't think I can ride my bike again. I'm definitely not going to race. Can I come work at Zipp?
Yeah.
You were still the technical director.
Yeah.
And you were like, yeah, but you might want to give it a little bit. I'm sure, I mean, I have the email saved, but I remember where you were like, yeah, like, if that's what you want, like, I think you basically like, well, we'd love to have you, but like, I'm not sure that's really what you want.
I've joked about that with a bunch of people that said, I think I spent, my God, how many years did I spend trying to hire you? And then the one time you came at me with like, hey, I think I'm ready. I was like, no, not yet. Hold on. Too rash. But it's funny how life works sometimes, right? But no, God, I just remember being such a terrifying from the outside moment, and then watching just really in awe as you came through it. I mean, you came out the other end of it, and you just kind of were right. I mean, certainly with the outside perspective, you were kind of right back at it. I mean, you were racing, got from almost dead, and you see the photos of the scene. I mean, it's some pretty graphic, horrifying stuff. So you were back racing what? I mean, it didn't seem like that long to me. I'm sure it felt like forever to you.
I mean, it was basically just shy of, I think, like it was March 23rd, and then I raced, I did a race in LA just to sort of see if I still could, like Olympic distance race was not great, but I think I really raced for the first time at IronMan Arizona on the November 21st. So, whatever that is, 7 months, 29 days. And I think it was interesting. Like, I remember once I sort of decided I was going to start going again, I had a conversation with my coach and Michael Kruger, and he said, "You're going to be better or worse. I guess we'll find out which." Right? And he said, like, nobody goes through this and then comes out the same.
The same, yeah.
And I think I for sure would not have won the races I did afterwards without that. And I think, I think a lot of it was, there was a mix of things. Some of it was, I think it was really good to have actually as much time off as I did. And it's interesting, like, that was literally the only time in my entire career that I was ever, quote unquote, injured. And I sometimes say that was both a blessing and a curse, right? Like, I think you see sometimes that I think if I had like an injury and I'd been forced to take some time off, that might have actually been like probably a healthy thing. And I think having that big layoff, like it allowed me to kind of recharge and recover, and there was a lot of benefit to that. And I think there's a bunch of times when I was like, I can't take a week off, and to have like think back and be like, I took like 5 months off, right? Like, what do you mean I can't take a week off, right? And I think to have lost that, and I think there was also I had a very clear sort of singularity of purpose and focus, and like that also drifted. And I think that's the thing that, the two guys that jump out to me the most in our sport now would be Jan Frodeno and Sebastian Kienle, both of whom I think, have been for an unbelievable period of time, been able to maintain that singular focus. I think on the cycling side, right, I think, it's amazing to see, like, Peter Sagan seems to, I think, a little bit like Roger Federer, right? Like, they were the guy that weren't serious enough, and then you're like, but I think I'm glad they weren't serious, right? Like, they weren't serious until they were ready to be serious, and then when they were ready, then they were all in. And I think like I wasn't able to kind of hang on to that enough, which is hard. Yeah.
And do you think, though, as a, and I don't want to say this in a way to like paint it against anybody else, but as a really bright guy, who's got a million things rattling around in his head all the time, do you think some of that was just you mentally being ready for the next thing?
Yeah, I definitely, I overthought it in the short term and in the long term, right? Like, I think, I had obsessed about the details and, the marginal gains, and then lost that obsession, and then sort of instead obsessed over like, oh, I can't take a day off, right? I can't take a week off. Like, I have to do this race because I've signed up for it. I think, I should have had way more DNFs in my career. I should have had way more, even more than, like, I don't think I had like one or two, maybe two, like, did not starts, like, for a race that I signed up for, and like that number for sure should have been higher, right? And I think like that's where I lost that perspective, and I think I always had interest in sort of what was next. And I think in a lot of ways there was good stuff that came out of that, right? I think like that was a lot of the work that I did and, still do, with Zipp, SRAM. It started with you and I, and then has continued. I'm testing a set of wheels for Zipp right now. No comment. Except to say that I ride around on the road on these wheels. I did a tire pressure test. I'm on 37. There's 700 wheels. I'm riding 38 mil tires, and I did like a 4-hour ride at 24 psi, and it was awesome. Right, which like blows my mind.
Yeah.
But I think that's where it's like it's fun now to have that perspective. But and that's what I had gotten away from. And I think it's awesome. The gravel is great for that. Riding on the track is especially nice for that. And I think I wish that I had kept more of that. But yeah, like I definitely sort of I did outsmart myself in a lot of ways as well, right? Where I was like, there were some times like where I made equipment changes where I was like, I have no idea why I made that equipment change. Like that was definitely me being, too clever. I think it's hard if you're sort of a tinkerer and a detail person, right? To not to silo that to the things where it should be, and to not kind of go off on some of these wild goose chases. Like we had a talk with Tim Reed about this. I mean, Tim Reed is a notorious tinkerer, and he will tell you, like, yeah, there's definitely races that I've blown because I adjusted my saddle height like the day before the race. And you're like, yeah, don't do that. But at the same time, that's also why that tinkering, right, is also why he's a world champion. So like you gotta take the good with the bad. Like I have shelved this sort of idea for a book that basically says, right, that the sort of focus of the book is a lot of what I think I learned as a triathlete, and it's all like your strengths and your weaknesses. The big ones are all the same thing. It's just a matter of perspective, right? Like I sort of came to me as like this great quote, right? Like obsessed is a word that the lazy use to describe the dedicated, and I'm like, that is true, but it's also not, right? Like obsession is also like that is a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
And there is a line between dedication and obsession, but they go hand in hand, right? It's like people who are laid back, there's times when that's also laziness, and so I was asked, like, could I have actually had that perspective? Could I have actually been like more laid back? Could I? And it's like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe not. Right?
I have to say, I don't see it in you, but no, it's interesting. I love, you mentioned Sagan and Frodeno. I've worked with both of them for years and years. And, I think it's interesting, like Frodeno to me is one of the riders that I think maybe doesn't get enough credit for how technical and kind of into that side of the sport he is. I know I get emails and text and stuff from him kind of all the time with like ideas he's had or things he's seen, like he'll see somebody else with something and shoot it in an email of like, what do you think this is? What do you think they're doing? And you think, wow, gosh, it is amazing this far into his career on top of the world, and he's still kind of hyper focused on that next thing, that next increment. And a little bit the same, but a little bit different. Peter Sagan going from, really kind of such a screw off, right? He was just so naturally talented. And I think, young Peter reminded me of so many of the folks I saw in like the U.S. national program, where you'd have these amazing talents roll in and then just flame out in a couple years because they were so good and it was so easy for them that once it got hard, they were just on to the next thing. And then I think for him, when it got hard, he realized, wait a minute, if I don't keep this together, I lose it. And then he kind of doubled down. And I know he's notorious at team camps for, they all go ride for 4 hours and come and put the bikes up. And then you'll see him an hour later going out on another ride. I think he's gotten his head a little bit straight on that. Kind of doubling down on that aspect of it. But yeah, I think it's impossible. It's got to be impossible to keep that level of focus for that period of time, right? A little bit like your coach said, it's going to get better. It's going to get worse. But I don't see in anybody over that long of a period, it doesn't stay the same.
Yeah, I think, Michael Phelps would be the sort of all-time, I think, in that regard, where you're like, just incredible to keep it that level of focus and performance.
Yeah.
And I think from a rowing background, Stephen Redgrave, when people talk about like Michael Phelps is the greatest Olympian, and I'm like, no, right? Like Redgrave to me, right? 5 golds over 5 Olympics. Yeah. And like, unlike Michael Phelps, right? Redgrave had one shot.
Right.
It's not like, oh, if I mess up at this one, right? Like he had one chance to get it right. And he did every time, right? So like, I think there's no question to me that, it's Redgrave. I think, Phelps, and it's interesting, like I remember talking with Simon Whitfield about this, right? And it's like, where he said, like if you look at Phelps's sort of track record, right, and this idea of sort of, it's the sheer number of golds, right? It's like, at that time, this was after Beijing, right? He's like, I had 3 chances right? Like that's it, right? And at any given Olympics, I had one chance,
Right.
And this idea that somehow like because he has X number of medals and I have a gold, an 11th place, and a silver, that somehow like he is like a better Olympian. I mean, like that made him like pissed off. I mean, which is I think a testament, right, to like the fact that Simon, I think you have to be super competitive. Like I remember that like it sort of he had a bit of a dust up at his last Olympics, unfortunately, and like someone said like like something like, you're such a diva, and he's like, and this is somehow surprising. Right? Like
yeah
like that's what it takes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. 100%, right? It's at some level you've got to have it to
right. And
make
I mean, I think the same is true with Jan. I mean, it's like the Continental story, right? Where it's like, of course he wants the tires only for himself, right? And I'm sure like with Peter, it's the same thing. Where people, oh, you're like, he's very hard to deal with, and you're like, yes, and like that's the point.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, and I think especially, I think of that in road racing. I mean, these sprinters, right? It in that moment, they're essentially risking death. For whatever for this 200 meters, they're all a little bit crazy. And I mean, I always think of Cavendish with his line of, don't listen to anything I say when I have my helmet on. But we worked together for a bunch of years, and he is just this sweet, normal, easy to get along with guy in real life. But you see the things that he does and said, and a lot of that stuff that he got a bad rap for on the bike, and you think, in that moment, you got to be that way, or you don't win.
Yeah, I remember talking with Chris McCormick about this, right? And it's like, and I was like, Chris, I don't understand, like, where people are like, like he's so arrogant, and I'm like, yes, and I was like, but that's what it takes, right? And I said to Chris once, I was like, I would step on your throat on the way to the finish line, and then immediately have a beer with you afterwards.
Right,
but like, make no mistake, right? Like I would, I would dig my heel into your neck to get to the finish line ahead of you, and he's like, of course, right, like, right, like, why would you do it any other way? But I think like that's the hard part, right, is for the people who can't turn it off afterwards. And I think, and I mean, I certainly had got into that less about, I think, other people and more, I think, in terms of myself, right? I think one of the nice things now is, like if I go to the track or if I race on Zwift and all of that, like I care as much as possible and then not at all.
Right.
And that's what's all, like, that's what I didn't have. And I think, that's where you see, Jan had talked about that, right? I mean, he used to be that he was that way all the time. And I think the part of the reason that he has been able to sustain it is that he has been able to let go of it when he's not on the race course. Because, you can't sustain that 24/7.
Yeah. Well, and it ultimately drives people away, which causes its own problems and its own stresses. And I think that's a great point. So you just mentioned Zwift, and I know as we're recording this, we are all on home quarantine with the coronavirus, and I'm sure that Zwift is probably signing up like record numbers of people. I just got on it myself, and this is actually part of how this interview started, was me sending Jordan an email to say, hey, I finally got on Zwift, and you're right, it's awesome. And so give us, I guess you started with a little background, but how'd you end up there, and tell us a little bit about what you do with Zwift.
Sure. So I better start with what I do. So my role is that I am a game designer, which is sort of a pretty broad umbrella. When people are like, what do you do? Well, I design Zwift. What does that mean? Well, depends on a lot of things. And I do now, I do a fair bit of development as well, like in terms of actually programming. But, it's coming to it, I think, with a very kind of cohesive sense of the experience, both from a technical standpoint. I think we don't have the role technical director, and it certainly means something. But I think, a lot of what you did at Zipp, I would say, is I view my own role in a similar way of sort of the technical umbrella, but, at the same time, Zwift as a technical product in terms of experience. So, we have really good physics. We have very real-world physics, but, one of the first projects that I led was actually a way to parameterize them, so we can actually sort of change them on the fly for, events, and like that's been super fun. And it has been just this evolving journey of working initially on training plans, and then I think getting more and more into what I guess I would call sort of systems design and a lot of that. And the training aspect, which is what I first started, like that's really how I got started at Zwift. Like I came to it, we had an abnormally rainy winter in sort of January, February 2017, and I was not someone who ever rode indoors, and I started riding on Zwift, and I was like, oh, this is pretty fun, and then just found it was a really great training tool, and came to it from that. And I knew John Mayfield and sort of the Zwift story of how it got started on Slow Twitch, and just kind of struck up an email conversation with him. Initially approached them about sponsorship, actually, like, hey, I love Zwift, use it for training, like, would you guys be interested? And that sort of love to do more, help you with the training content, and that sort of conversation sputtered out and kind of didn't really go anywhere. And then I got a call from John in July or August 2017, and it's like, well, we've thought about it a lot, definitely not going to sponsor you, but how would you like a job? And I had been considering, retiring for a bit at that point, right? I had applied for 2 jobs. One was with a startup up in Silicon Valley that kind of fell through. The other was actually for the role of high performance director at Princeton, going back to my alma mater in the athletic department. They ended up not actually filling that position at all, but I think that would have been super interesting. So yeah, sort of one, like in 2015, it was applied for this job as a startup up in Silicon Valley. 2016, applied for the high performance position, and then 2017 sort of had this opportunity come up, from Zwift, and I was like, yeah, like I am ready. I'm ready to do something different. A lot of it was the business side of the sport of triathlon had never really been something I was super comfortable with. I didn't enjoy contract negotiations, and I think it was harder and harder to kind of find like a good home. A lot of I think the core people that I had great relationships with had moved on, and like like you and Andy had both left Zipp. Like a lot changed when I left Specialized. Like I said, I was talking with Mark Cody and Chris Yu, who are now like super senior at Specialized, and it's awesome to see that. And I said, like, like I will always consider myself a Specialized athlete, right? Like that's just, and it definitely, like I got cut from them at the end of 2014, and I would say my career was never really the same. Like when I signed with them, I thought like I would be like a Peter or maybe Javier, right? Like I would be a lifetime athlete. And like it definitely, I regret not fighting harder to keep that, because I think that was a lot of like my grounding and like my identity was, I think, was this, like that Specialized is so cutthroat, and I mean that as like both a criticism and a compliment. But I think it was very much in sync with like who I was when I was at my best, and I think letting that go and straying from that was hard. And I think once I stopped that, I never really felt like I was the same anymore, and I was more interested in moving on. Andy leaving and you leaving Zipp also was like, like I was sort of like I was a Zipp Specialized athlete, and like that once I wasn't a Specialized athlete, and once it didn't mean the same thing to be a Zipp athlete, like I didn't sort of have my grounding in the same way. And I think I was certainly open. Plus having kids, at that point, we had just had our 4th, and I think I was the sport from a financial standpoint was more uncertain. I was certainly looking for more stability. I love to train. I mean, I think I had my, best year in terms of fitness and a lot of that, but the sport had also, triathlon had changed too. I think more of an appetite for flat courses, kind of fast courses, sub 8 times,
Yeah.
Like I never won a race, an Ironman race going under 8:10, and like that was just by the nature of the courses that I did well at, and those courses weren't as popular. And so, when John called and said, like, would you be interested in a job doing, design, and mostly I think, it's interesting, he hired me for sure mostly on like the training side, and that's probably that is for sure a minority of what I do. I think he expected that to be like 100% or at least like 90% of my job. I think it's probably 10%. But I've never regretted that decision. Like, I've never had second thoughts. Like I have bad days at work like everyone, but I've never wished to be doing something else. And I've never had a sense of like, oh, I wish to go back to triathlon. Like, I got so much more out of my career than I ever expected to. That it's hard. Of course I wanted to win more races. Of course I would have liked to have, I think had a top 10 or a podium at Kona, and I think I could have. And obviously, but I wouldn't say I have regrets. Because I got, I think I said I wanted to win an Ironman, and I did. And then I said I wanted to win a world championship, and I did. And like from that standpoint, right? It's like, yeah, like what else?
Yeah.
What else would I really have asked of the sport, right? I mean, I was able to basically support, a family and have an awesome career and travel the globe and basically like swim, bike, and run for a living for almost a decade. Like, yeah, like hard to ask for much more than that.
Yeah. Well, and then you've landed really an awesome place. I mean, doing something pretty awesome. I'm sure most of our listeners are probably listening and thinking like, yeah, I want to do all that stuff. I'd be happy doing any of that stuff, much less all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing that I'm, so thankful for, really, I mean, every day is that, there is no guaranteed off-ramp, from being a pro triathlete. You don't have the financial security that you maybe have from, being in a big team sport. You don't necessarily have an obvious skill set. I think you see a lot of people go into coaching because they don't know what else to do, right? You definitely see a lot of guys who race, I think, pass when they would probably like to retire because they don't know what else to do. Yeah. I think there is no guaranteed kind of smooth transition. And like literally I was a pro one day and I had a really good, very stable, awesome full-time job the next. And it's like, like I've certainly been lucky a lot of times in my life, but that in many ways feels like, one of the biggest.
No, that's phenomenal. Yeah, I will say I've had that conversation with more pros than I can count that they know they're in it too long and they're just kind of over it, but they're not sure what else to do. And that's a really hard place, right? So yeah, kudos to you for making the 12-hour transition.
The funniest thing was, I think, was when I first started, like when I was like, I'm going to be a pro, I think this was like 2005, I was 24 at the time, I was sort of talking and I was like, like I could see myself racing until like I'm about 37. Like, I think that's, and I mean, literally I was 37 for 3 weeks and then I retired, right? So like, be careful what you put out into the world, right? Like if I had said 39, would I have had 2 more years of racing, right? I remember saying this as just like a throwaway comment of like, 37. And I mean, at that time it was based around, because I think Mark Allen, right? Like that was how old he was when he won his last in Kona, right? And so I was like, seems like that's good, and then, and then I sort of forgot about it until I was like, oh yeah, right? Like, did I, right? Did I set that clock, and then subconsciously or not, right? So
wow, that's awesome.
Be careful of the predictions you make.
That's awesome. So tell us, where will we find you on Zwift? Or I guess let's start with, what's your favorite course?
The Alp.
The Alp. Okay.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, that was one of the hardest secrets to keep, and I mean, one of the most was test riding that, and it was super interesting because like when we were laying we have the turn markers and they're all color coded. So there's red, orange, and yellow, and it's based on basically the perceived kind of difficulty of that segment. And that all comes because like we were like, wow, we should color code them and kind of come up, give some people some sense. And so like to do that, it was like, like we're sort of running up there with a simulator and all that. And I was like, no, we can't do it. Like, and so like one day I basically just like went and I went full gas, and it was like, and then basically replaying that was how those color code. And I think that was one of the most immersive experiences that I've ever had. I mean, it's interesting. Somebody posted on Reddit, the Yates twins just led a ride up the Alp, and someone said it was one of like the most transformative and sort of transcendental digital experiences of their life. And like the Alp is really like, it is pretty magical. The other place that recently I was riding in Titans Grove, and we have a natural day-night cycle in Zwift. I forget the exact like time period, but it's really interesting. So our founder creator John Mayfield, he is by training a kind of graphics and engine programmer, and like a real math and kind of geek. Like he's loves astrophotography and stuff like that. But
awesome.
We have these really phenomenal, and like this is where people like they're running it on their phone. I'm like, get a good setup, like run Zwift at 4K, like, or at least run it, in HD.
Yeah.
And I'm riding through Titans Grove, which is our basically Northern California's sycamore redwood forest, and like at this certain time, and we have basically day-night cycle, and then we also have like fog cycles. And so we have this fog coming in, and then the like sun is really low, and there's these like God rays coming through. And John basically like he programmed them. He's like, I just picked up a white paper on how like that happens, and basically was like, just program that math.
Wow.
And like
that's so cool.
and like I just remember like coming through, right, and it's like this like sunrise in Watopia, and it was just super magical. And I think that's the thing that still blows me away, is it's fun. Like I mean, like I have it can go into like fly around mode, and sometimes like I'll take people like on this sort of like helicopter tour of Watopia, and right when they're like, oh wow, like the level of richness, like to fly inside the waterfall and stuff like that, and to have seen all that. But yeah, like just riding around, like I lose myself there, right? Like I don't I do a lot of riding on Zwift by necessity, but I also, if I go, like I will miss it if I don't ride in there. And I think to find it, it is this very, and I think enabling hardware is a huge part of it, right? Like I think the first time I rode on Zwift, it was on like a classic trainer, just using my power meter, and riding it for the first time on a smart trainer. It's like, oh wow, like that level of like, you go uphill and you feel it. And I think it's interesting, like there's a lot of, it's when your heart rate is high, right? Like to that point of like, the Mark Cavendish, like don't believe anything I say when the immersion comes because, your senses are heightened, right? Your heart rate is up, you're working hard, right? Like you are suffering in this world, and like that suffering makes it real. Like, I think, cause I've flown through and, sort of simmed, my way through the course when I'm doing like course design stuff, and it's, it's like, this is nothing, right? Like, I mean, it's cool, but it's not, but like when you're on there, right, and your heart rate is like pounding, and it's going through the roof, like, I mean, you just lose yourself in there. I mean, I made the mistake once of racing on rollers, and we went hard 90-degree turn, and I crashed because, of course, like, I went to make the turn, and so now I no longer race on my rollers. But you don't. You sort of can lose you forget how immersive it is, right? And I think that's the thing, right? That like, I mean, we have good graphics, but I mean, they're not. But I think it's the emotional significance, right? Of like the blood, sweat, tears, pain, that your people pour in, right? And I think that's where I say that we're not a simulator, but the realism and the sort of integrity of the platform is hugely important to us. Like that's why we don't have flying bikes. Like we don't.
Right.
We care a lot that like a mile in Zwift sort of counts in the same way, which is a big part of why Strava agreed to have this concept of a virtual activity, because of the detail that we put in there.
I love it. I love your enthusiasm makes me want to go ride Zwift. It's pretty awesome. That is pretty awesome. All right. Well, so I have a handful of questions. You can choose to answer or not answer any of them. I hope you answer them. But you already hit my first one was favorite bike. You said nose cone shiv earlier. Is that all-time favorite bike?
Yeah. I mean, I have an Argon 18 Electron Pro, and I love the purity of it, right? Like no derailleur, no water bottle, single gear, fixed. And I mean, it is a brilliant, like, purpose-built machine. But I think the nose cone shiv was my favorite because it was this incredible purpose-built machine that was still fantastically functional in the way that a track bike isn't, right? Like I trained, long hours on that bike. And it's funny because it sort of was the first bike that I gave away. And there are times when I sort of wish that I had it, but also like that sort of giving, I gave away a bunch of bikes, and like that thing and having that be a thing that I did was so awesome that I feel so grateful to have done it with that bike. And I mean, I will be honest, the main reason that I gave the bike away was that I don't think I could have had it and not ridden it. And so when Specialized was basically like, you need to switch or we're going to cancel your contract, I was like, well, I got to figure out a way to get rid of the bike, because if I see that bike in the garage, I will not be able to not race on it.
Oh, that's funny.
But
that's funny. All right. Least favorite bike.
Least favorite bike. I'm trying to think. I should probably take a pass actually on this.
Okay.
now that I think about it, yeah. There is an obvious answer, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's
What?
a bit of a rough.
No, I won't push that too far. What you and I worked together on a ton of stuff for a ton of years. What favorite Zipp thing? And it doesn't have to be one of that was you and me. It could be after that. I don't care.
No, I would say the Firecrest project, like that was super.
That was awesome.
Just, I think there was a bunch of technical writing that I did that came out of that, talking about that project, the presentation that we did at Interbike on that, I think the really, I think, transformative from a technical standpoint, right? Solving that translation rotation problem with CFD and then seeing that on the road, right? And then I think, especially even for me, right, feeling that on the road of like taking those wheels out and being like, oh, this is different.
Yeah.
Right. This is like really different. I think that was the most exciting because it was something where, like, was a part of so much of it. I think that I valued just like being a part of that project in such a deep way. There wasn't really, I think, the only thing that I think came close to that was the involvement on the first VUCA Stealth, which I think was like, having a big part of the way that bar came to be.
Yeah.
But, like bars are a bit more transient, right? Like I think, like when people ask about wheels, right? Where it's like, now it's been 12 years. And I think I've literally in 12 years, I have never ridden on anything other than a pair of Zipp wheels, right? For 12 years straight.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm with you. That fire.
And in that,
in
that time, right? I think when people are like, hey, I once had a spoke hole collapse. That's the sum total of my problems.
That's good.
In 12 years.
Yeah, no, that Firecrest thing was. I always look back at that so fondly as it. We didn't fully realize it. I guess it felt like we were kind of changing the world, and then as we got closer to the end, there was kind of that moment where, I remember Michael Hall, one of these late nights, saying something to the effect of like, oh shit, we just invented the future. He just, in that way that he, only he could say it, but it was like, it just landed in that moment of like, oh God, yeah, all that stuff that we've been saying and doing and learning, that's all real and it's all happening. Holy crap. Right. You just don't get too many of those, in a career. So that was, and it was such a group effort, right? It wasn't, one of us had a great idea and we pulled it off. It was the team at Zipp, it was you, it was the team at the wind tunnel, Matt Godo, and the team at Intelligent Light and Star CCM. And I mean, my God, there were, all said and done, there were like, whatever, 25 of us. And yeah, I love that. I'd love to find a video. If you know where to find it, let me know, of the that talk we gave at Interbike, because that was that was just awesome to kind of unleash it on the world and look at all those people's faces as they sat there and like, what the hell are they talking about? That was
Yeah,
a
I
good
mean,
time.
some of those, that's like, this is right. Like, I'm sad that I'm happy that I didn't sort of have to be obsessed totally with social media for my entire career, but I'm also sad in that, like, a lot of these things, I'm like, I wish there was a video of that. Right? It's like, now there's a video of everything,
Yes,
but of course
yes.
that comes at a cost too, right? But I wonder if Interbike has those archived. I'm hopeful, but
Yeah.
not
I'll
necessarily.
dig around for that one. That was fun. Yeah, no, it is crazy to think, right? There's so much of this stuff that happened that nobody's got a picture of it or a video of it, and I know I'm warning my kids all the time, like, everybody's filming everything, right? Be careful what you say, what you do. It's a different world. I know it's brutal for these young pros coming up, right? I mean, they're so watched, and you've got to be so careful, and people who are out to make you look bad can pretty easily make you look bad. And I think that's another thing you see with both road and triathlon pros, right? It's like that constant curation of your image. That's a real stress in people's lives.
I'm so glad to not have to post to social media, right? Like, I can post what I want, right? And it does not impact my sort of compensation or perceived worth.
Right, right. Crazy world. Awesome. Last question. Favorite win?
I would say, I think this one is hard. I think on like Ironman Canada, the first one in 2009, I think because I sort of had set this bar of like, I'd love to win an Ironman at some point, right? And my wife is from Penticton. We were living in Penticton at the time, and it's this hometown race, and like to kind of do it, and it was like, okay, like this is this huge payoff, and I think like that one, like very much of that sort of like time stood still in the finishing shoot. At the same time, I think, and this is where I do feel like I sort of had like these two halves of the career, right? Because it was like, that was like this sort of like build up. And then I think coming back and then, racing the long distance world championships, as an American, on U.S. soil in, Henderson, Las Vegas, right? And like doing that thing, where you get to raise the American flag over your head, right? And I managed, and I didn't botch it, where like it goes into your face, right? Like, I have this great where the wind is like blowing in the right direction, and like, the flag is over billowing out, right? And I've got this like, USA across, like the, red, white, and blue race suit, USA on my chest, American flag over the head, like stepping across the finish line. You're like, every athlete, I think, like dreams of that, and then like getting the national anthem played, right? Like, I think that, to me, like when you imagine, like as a dream, I think that like the difference was that like with when I raced there, like I knew that I could do that, and I think like I won that race because I believed I could. And when I raced in and I won in Canada, like I didn't know yet that I was capable of that, right? And I think like that was like they're so different, right? Like the one sort of like showed me what I could do, and I think the other one was then the best sort of realization of the of that sense of sort of confidence and like swagger in a good way, I think, right? Like
well, and just executing the plan. Right, which is such a big part of it. It's one thing to say it and to know it, and then to actually go out and pull it together like that is brilliant. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 4-lap run course, and I think like I say, like over whatever, I think 24 IronMan races or something like that, I have probably a subtotal of like 60 seconds of memory. You know, like, I mean, and I include other, you know, like that race is sort of, you know, any like really long races. Like you don't remember things from races, which is good because like otherwise you wouldn't be able to race again.
You wouldn't do it. Yeah.
But I remember, you know, it's a 4-lap run course, and like it was like this figure 8 that crossed over and going into the final lap, right? Like I was, you know, sort of, you know, in the lead, but I mean it was definitely not a foregone conclusion. And like my coach was there, and he just basically, as I'm running by, he goes, you know, like, you do it now for a world championship. And like, I was like, yeah, right. Like I got 7.5K to get it done, right? And
yeah,
you know, I think that was just like one of those, like, you know, I mean, there's so many people and it's so loud, and I just that phrase, right? Like, you know,
yeah,
just still stands out. I remember that so clearly, you know, and I think to then do it, it's like, whew, yeah, I mean,
that's brilliant.
I mean, I don't miss, you know, I love what I do, but I think there is, those types of moments are certainly, I mean, that type of magic is not something you get, you know, there in really anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, awesome. I just love it. Well, that's a beautiful place for us to end. Jordan, thank you so much for your time and your stories, and it's really been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Josh. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much of my, you know, career in so many ways that was defined through the people that I knew, and you know, the relationship that I had with you and with Andy, you know, and with Zipp as sort of as a brand and a family, I think was so much a part. And still, I mean, I'm you know, of all of the things, right? Like, I think, you know, I've been riding Zipp wheels for 12 years, and, you know, I think it'll hopefully be, I don't see why I'd ever stop, you know, but I think that all comes from, you know, this friendship that, you know, that we've had. And it's awesome now, right, to be riding, you know, with Zipp wheels with, you know, SILCA bar tape and bottle cages and, you know, a SILCA pump and a SILCA seat capsule. And, you know, I think to see where you've landed, right? I think like that in the same way, to see what you've taken with this brand with incredible history, but then made it your own, and, you know, and your passion for American manufacturing and like innovation, you know, there's, I am inspired by what you do on a regular basis as well.
Oh, well, you're very kind. You just reminded me of a story that, you know, when I announced I was leaving Zipp and SRAM, I didn't announce what I was doing for, I think there was a week or two there. That, you know, Zipp SRAM really wanted the message to just be Josh is leaving and not saying what I was doing. And I just remember getting a text message from you that you had heard through the grapevine I was leaving, and it was something to the effect of, whatever you're doing next, I'm in. And it just was one of those moments of like, oh man, like there's people out there that have my back, you know. It's a team effort, right? And it's I really love that about our sport and in our industry as well. So thank you. Your words mean a lot. Awesome. Well, we will wrap it up there, Marginal Gains listeners and or Marginal Gains TV viewers. And thanks again, Jordan. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Josh.